Hello and welcome to today's episode of Evolutionary Horror and Genomics podcast. Today we have a very special guest all the way from North Carolina State University. And when I say all the way, I mean via the magic of the internet. Rob Dunn is a William Neal Reynolds Distinguished Professor and Senior Vice Provost for University Interdisciplinary Programs. That's a mouthful, so that's a lot of work. So we are very, very excited to have him taking the time to be in our podcast. Hi, Rob. Welcome to the podcast.
Good evening, Anna. How are you doing?
I'm very well, thank you. And yes, it's evening for me. I guess morning for you.
It is, well, it feels like evening already, but maybe it's just one of those days.
Maybe. So it is October, which means it's Halloween month. So I'm just going to do a very short parenthesis to say that microbes are everywhere and they in every ecosystem, and they are essential for life on Earth as we know it. But today, because it's a Halloween special episode, we are going to focus more on the spooky and the weird rather than the other parts. So, and even just not even thinking about elsewhere, in nature and so on, but even in us and on us, there are just so many microbes. Do you know more or less? There's different ways of estimating, I guess, and depending on where you read, there's a different number, but more or less, what is the range that is estimated that a human has in and on them?
Well, I mean, I guess I would back up a little bit and think about, like, how do we think about what it even means to be human? Because for me, one of the spookiest things about microbes is the fact that when we really think about our relationship with microbes, the whole idea of the human disappears. Like, and to me, that's, I mean, I don't know what could be spookier than the reality that yourself is less separate from the rest of the living world than we think it is. And so for me, one of the ways I like to think about that is, so if we rely on our visual systems and we just look at each other, we see our bodies, we see our eyes, we see our faces, and none of that seems very microbial. But if we appreciate other humans in other ways, and so if you close your eyes, for example, and you're in a room crowded with people, and you focus in that darkness on your sense of smell, almost all of the smells coming from other people are microbial. And so, like, the wonderful smells of other humans, the terrible smells of other humans, from a olfactory perspective, that part of yourself is almost all the microbial self. And that's true for how mosquitoes respond to us. Like, when mosquitoes are attracted to us or go away from us, they're primarily responding to the smells of our microbes. And so for me, that version of how much of us is microbial is it's spookier. Just this sense that if we ignore our vision, the most fundamental parts of ourselves are actually not ourselves. That is intriguing to me. But also, we could think about measuring ourselves with regard to things like our behavior. And so if you think about your behavior, you think about like just how you behave on an average day. That seems like something that's not alterable based on which species live on you. But we know that is also a function of which microbes inhabit your body. And so, for example, just minor changes in which species are in your body can totally change your behavior. And so we know this from experiments with mice and rats, that if you change the microbes that are in the guts of mice and rats, you can cause mice and rats to have behaviors that are more like the behaviors we see with schizophrenia. But also, there are individual species that if you happen to be infected by them, can totally change your behavior. So, Anna, do you have a cat?
No, my parents do.
And so we think of our cats as being very separate from us, but your parents' cat is exchanging microbes with your parents, whether they want that to be the case or not. And one of those microbes that your parents' cat can give them is a beast called Toxoplasma gondii. And this is a weird parasite that can only have sex inside cats. Um, and so it sort of has a strange reality it has to confront, because it has to figure out, how does it get into cats in the first place? And the way it does this in the wild is that it tends to get ingested by herbivores or omnivores. And so very often that's mice and rats. And then in those mice or rats or even cows, it finds its way into the brains of the mice and rats and cows, and it releases the precursor to dopamine. And that, along with other changes that the parasite triggers in the mice and rats, actually makes the mice and rats more likely to be attracted to the smell of cat pee. And so more likely to actually get ingested by cats. It also makes the mice and rats more likely to take risky behaviors. And so this crazy parasite, this spooky parasite, can change the behavior of a mouse or a rat in your house, in your parents' house. But the other thing we now know is that when people are infected by this same parasite, that the parasite can also affect human behavior and make people less risk averse, more likely to take risks. And so here's just one individual microbial species that can actually affect human behavior. And so then one thing you might ask is the behavior you associate with your parents actually fully their behavior, or is that their behavior is influenced by microbes that they've picked up from their cat? And it's actually very difficult to say. And so as you go out into the world today, the reality is that the people around you are partially behaving in response to their own genes and their own experiences, but they're also partially being influenced by these microbial responses. And so that to me also is a pretty spooky reality of our daily lives. It's way easier to overlook because it's so strange, it's hard to cope with. But our very identity is shaped by the details of which species we've been exposed to. And I don't know if, is my identity shaped by that particular parasite? Certainly it's shaped by what other microbes I have. And that's true for all of us. And so I think this question of like how much microbial, I think for me, it's more interesting to measure how much of what we think of as ourselves is microbial. And it's a lot.
Yeah, so that's both fascinating and scary at the same time. So yeah, I'm familiar with the toxoplasma because a friend of mine got it when she was in her mother's womb. Fortunately, it was only the last trimester, so it only affected her eyes rather than more severely the rest of the nervous system. But just it went, you started off and I thought, romantically, it's kind of interesting to see that if pheromones, and if you're interested in someone, it might be the microbiome. And then suddenly it escalated to actually microbes and parasites and so on are the ones ruling the world and controlling us a little bit. And it does beg the question of how much of us is us, or the microbes, or obviously the both together. So as you mentioned, there is this point where we almost become not separate from the microbiome, and we are a whole. And that reminded me also of these creepy spores of some fungi. I think it's Ophia cordyceps or something like that, so that they land on ants and then also control their behavior, right? That's also
Yeah,
very creepy.
Sandra Anderson from the Center for Evolutionary Hologenomics is an expert on those fungi and those ants. But the sort of similar to the Toxoplasma gondii, the fungi take over the ants, and they cause the ants to climb up, in most cases high on a branch, and the ants then are triggered by the fungus to bite down on the branch, and then the fungus grows out of the top of the ant, where it's more likely to be ingested by a bird and dispersed. And so the ant and the fungus and their behavior sort of fuse. Like the behavior becomes the collective behavior of the ant's genes and the fungus's genes, but the behavior yields the benefit of the fungus, but not the ant, which is eventually turned into fungus. And this is actually a pretty common lifestyle in nature, that microbes take over their hosts and cause them to do different things. And I think it's interesting when we look at scary movies, that a lot of the things that we see in scary movies that most terrify us are actually quite common around the world and in nature. And that I think the natural versions of those terrifying scenarios are often more sinister than the ones that movies depict.
Yeah, most definitely. And then it's almost like a secret life, right? Because we don't see them unless they grow into a huge colony, and then we can see them because they're so small. But and they're inside us, or they're hiding, but they are there, and they have amazing life strategies. So definitely it's so fascinating to see all these different strategies. And I was doing some research for this episode. So you wrote a bunch of books, and I was there's one called Never Home Alone, where you introduce the readers to it says here in the review about 200,000 species of microbes that are in your house and do all sorts of things. Even when you think your house is squeaky clean, they are there. When everything looks quiet and you don't see them, they are there. So moving on a little bit from you as a home or an ecosystem to your home, which, as you said, everything is connected. You, your microbiome, your pets, your house, your furniture. So out of these around 200,000 or whatnot species, which ones are associated more with specific, do you know, with specific rooms in the house, for example?
Yeah, so if we look at so first of all, you should think of your house as, I mean, again, our eyes deceive us. I mean, I think our eyes have really led us to believe that the world is full mostly of relatively large species like us, of mammals and birds and plants. And in fact, most of the living world is tiny, so the recent estimates suggest there might be 1 trillion species of bacteria. 30,000 of those species are named, so we've barely even started. And every place we've ever studied, ever looked for life, we've found life. And in houses, so there's this patina of living forms everywhere, and it includes bacteria, it includes lots of animals, lots of micro animals. But the more extreme a habitat is in a house, the more likely it seems to be to have its own unique life forms. And so in US houses, it's very common to have a hot water heater that heats the water before it goes up to the rest of the house. And in those hot water heaters, we find bacteria that are known from hot water heaters and from hot springs like those you see in Iceland. And as a result, the tap water that comes out of the tap in those houses has these totally unique bacteria in it that appear totally harmless, but are unique to that habitat. By the same token, if you think about where the water is coming from, ultimately that comes to your house, the water always, tap water always has microbes in it. It often has crustaceans in it. But the identity of those species in your tap water, who you're drinking, depends on where your water comes from. And so in Copenhagen, for example, when I started working in Denmark off and on, the water in Copenhagen was unchlorinated. And so it was largely a reflection of which species were living in the aquifer. Now it's chlorinated, but one still encounters hundreds of species in the tap water in Copenhagen. And there are even some little microcrustaceans that are pretty common in the tap water and fall into your drinking water. that are just a reflection of the cool biology that's underground all around the city. If you go into the kitchen, there are unique species that live in the freezer that are most common in freezers and in the Arctic. There are some extreme species that seem to be able to live in microwaves pretty well. We find species in salt shakers that are known from the ocean or from salt flats that actually live inside the salt crystals. And so it's everywhere that you look. And so each time you hold something up, each time you breathe in your house, you are encountering this whole world that's different depending where you are. And so to me, that's no longer spooky. I've sort of gotten used to the reality that world is there. But I think when I talk about that work, it often seems at best disconcerting to people, and some cases downright alarming. But it's there. It's, we've always lived in a world full of other species. We've always inhaled them with every breath and eaten them with every chomp. But we just don't see them. And so I think the thing that worries people is beginning to make sense of what it really means to be alive in a world of tiny creatures.
Yeah, definitely. And I think you already kind of answered question I was going to ask you, which is when people hear you talk about all this and all the invisible things even that are there, even when you think you've bleached everything, and you said it's disconcerting, because my question was, do people feel more reassured or scared, or more scared? Because I remember I studied microbiology. I'm a biologist. I studied microbiology at uni, and so then people went in two different directions. I grew up in the countryside, the dirt eating kind of kid. It's good for your immune system. It's fine. We're all part of this big thing. As long as they're not pathogenic, it's okay. So I was kind of already on that route. And the more I learned about them, the more okay I was with being in this ecosystem. But I had friends and colleagues who, the more they learned about it, they just became psychotic. One of them bought a second washing machine for the socks because after getting knowledge, they were just like wiping everything. And then there's also the problem, I guess, if you bleach everything out, then you might actually be creating some weird super resistant stuff. So what is the most common reaction when people know from you a little bit more about all this micro universe that lives happily in people's homes?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start by saying that to me, the thing that's scary about all of this is when people do try to kill all the species around them, they invariably favor species that are more dangerous to them. And so if you look at the cleaning things that say that they kill 98% of germs, that's precisely the worst percentage to kill because the other way to say that is favors the 2%. And the 2% are unlikely to be the good ones. The 2% are almost invariably things that are they're hard, by definition, they're hard to kill, and they're far more likely to be bad for you. And so that temptation to try to kill everything is a temptation that leads us to ruin. And so that, to me, as I think about the microbial world, that's what's actually scary, is that if we embark upon a future in which we try to kill everything small that's around us, it is a future that's very dangerous to us. And so in my experience, sometimes in talking about this microbial world, that people feel scared in such a way that they usher themselves into that very dangerous future. On the other hand, we partnered with an artist, Shoana Risu, a number of years ago, who's really done amazing microbial work. And we were working at the time on belly button microbes and getting people to help us to characterize which species live in human belly buttons as a measure of what's going on in the skin in general. And at the point that we began to work with Shoana, we'd worked on these microbes for a while, and I was actually pretty worried about just what you asked, Anna, that people had started uh, to sort of have worse behaviors toward microbes because of our work, exactly the opposite of what we intended. And so Joanna decided to do a project where she would have people sample their belly button microbes, and then she would ask them to talk to those microbes. And it seems silly at first, but she did it in Times Square. She did it elsewhere around the world. And what was immediately clear is that when she asked people to talk to their microbes, that they began to think about those microbes as other beings, as their partners in living. And so they began to have these new kinds of conversations. So what Joanna's work did was it prompted people to talk to their belly button microbes. And when people did that, they invariably began to talk to their microbes almost as if they were family members. And it engendered totally new kinds of conversations that were really amazing. And so for me, what that work made me think is that we need to find ways to start new conversations with these species around us, to start healthier conversations in which we realize that we were only going to survive into the future if we can bring with us these species that we depend on, these species that are really part of us. And so how do we begin to think of them not as something that's creepy, but as something that's part of being a healthy being, that's part of being whole. And the one example that really strikes me in this regard is that we work a lot on sourdough bread. And sourdough bread starters, they're microbial. They very often include body microbes. And people very often talk to and talk about their sourdough starters as though they're family members. And so they really bring these starters into the family. They talk about their birth. They talk about their death. They talk about the stories of the starters. And so what would it take for us to begin to think about our body microbes, our daily microbes in this way, to remind ourselves that they're part of our family, and that they're we're no less dependent on them than we are on our parents and our other human family members. And how do we engender that kind of relationship? And I don't fully know the answer, but I think if we can start to get closer to that kind of answer, we'll be on the road to a much healthier future.
Yeah, the sourdough is a great story, because each sourdough basically has the microbes from the hands of whoever handles it. So it is, as you said, also kind of personal, that my sourdough will be different from your sourdough and my neighbor's sourdough, and then that makes it unique and it's special. And definitely it's great to start having these conversations. So the belly, I didn't know about the belly button experiment, but that sounds great for people to actually embrace rather than run away from or think it's gross, or just go crazy and try to disinfect everything. And then, but I think there's a very fine line as well, because when we talk about microbes, either people don't have a reaction, or mostly either they're scared and disgusted, or if it's marketed right and it's all microbes, but now there's all these probiotics and all these yogurts full of lactobacillus. And recently here in Copenhagen, there's the Alchemist, the Michelin star restaurant. They're collaborating with maybe you and Victoria as well, from here, the center of the CEH, and they're using the microbes in the mouth of ants to make yogurt. So people go from, oh, gross bacteria, oh no, to I'm going to pay a lot of money for this very exquisite experience of having this yogurt made by the bacteria in ants. So people can change their minds, and they can definitely appreciate something that in a different context would have been probably weird or gross.
Yeah, I mean, I think two things there. I mean, one is that as humans, we're really capable of embracing cognitive dissonance, of maintaining multiple conflicting ideas at the same time. So at the same time, some of the same people who are bleaching everything in their houses and bleaching their socks and not letting their socks touch their underpants, are spraying probiotics that include, living bacteria over their kitchen, and so we have this disconnect. But I also think it's true that on the one hand, while as scientists, I think we've now been in this discussion about the role of microbes in our daily lives for a while now. It started in the late 1800s, but in the last 20 years, it's had this burst of recognition. But I think globally, for most people, it's still a new conversation. And so I think the reality is, most people don't think about any of this at all. And so on the positive side, we do have a chance to really be thoughtful about what these conversations should look like, because for most of the public, they're newer than I think they seem to us in our scientific bubbles.
Yeah, that is true. And we're going on a very positive, educational, informative note, which is really good. But since it's Halloween, maybe we could end up with some kind of weird or very spooky fact. So my last question to you is, what is the creepiest or weirdest or most dangerous invisible danger from microbes that people are really not aware because we don't see them?
Well, so I think I'll go the other direction on this one and say that I think one of the scariest things about microbes is that some of the species of microbes on which we depend for health and well-being are disappearing, and we don't know where they're going, and we don't know quite why they're disappearing. And so to me, that's pretty spooky. And so one of the microbes was historically really common in breast milk and really common in the guts of most babies is becoming rarer and rarer, and we don't totally know why. And so I think that's a pretty spooky mystery that's happening all around us. But maybe is there another is the other kind of spooky? I mean, in your visual, you have lots of floating around bats, and I think one of the other things we don't yet know about microbes is that bats seem capable, at least some species of bats, of surviving despite having many more kinds of pathogenic microbes in their body than humans are capable of dealing with. And so that's sort of a spooky reality. What is it about bats that allows them to fly around full of all of these extras that we can't cope with? But I still love bats are among the most amazing species on Earth, and so I don't want to leave us on a bad note about bats either. So I don't know where to go with the end of that there, Anna.
Maybe they don't bleach out their environment, because yeah, I remember when I went on holiday somewhere in the tropical forest, I had to get all 3 shots of rabies because of bats. So definitely I would have died if I got it, and they're just fine. But I loved your answer, because and this is why we have you on this episode, because you always twist the question to a much more interesting angle. So and spooky and scary can be many things, right? So it's not just boo kind of, but it is very scary to think that for example in these bacteria in milk are disappearing, because then what will be of us, and what will be the consequence, and why, what is causing this, as you say. So we don't know, but definitely something is changing in a way that is making them disappear. So not knowing that, and not knowing what's next or why it's happening is definitely very scary, because then it also leads us to think that the same is happening a little bit everywhere with other things that we haven't even started to study.
Yeah, that's right. When almost all species of microbes are not yet studied, our ability to see what's missing is very humble. And so I think these cases where we've begun to see that we're losing things probably speak to a much broader loss that we're barely beginning to understand.
So thank you very much, Rob, for this spooky / weird, but mostly very entertaining and educational and then hopefully enlightening episode. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from North Carolina.
Thank you, Anna. Have a great evening.
Thank you. You too.